The final portion of this IAM section is going to focus on roles. Roles are super useful because I was talking about how IAM is integrated with a lot of different services. Usually that's through roles. I can't even think of any off the top of my head that use users, but if you're constructing something in some service, then chances are it might ask you for a role or it might want you to make a role. So, roles and users, again, are both entities you can create in IAM, and you can attach IAM policies to both of them. And it works in a similar way, where a role with a certain IAM policy can only call what that IAM policy allows, just like how a user with an attached IAM policy can only call and get what that IAM policy allows. But there's a few differences when comparing roles to users that we have to talk about. So, I'm going to go through the slides first, and then we'll do the interactive portion, and hopefully that will make it make more sense. And again, if you can understand policies, users, and especially roles, then I think you're in a really good place to expand your knowledge base in terms of AWS. So, diving into this, like I mentioned before, roles have an attached policy just like users saying what they can or cannot do. They also have an access key and a secret access key, just like a user's, but roles have one more API key called a session token, which we'll see. And the session tokens, you can tell it's a session token because it's really big. It's pretty obvious when it's a session token. Another key difference is when we were looking at users, I said you became the user, right? You were calling the APIs as that user. For roles, you can think of roles in that way if it helps you understand, but technically it's different. So with roles, you quote assume a role and you still get API creds back, but you more have a temporary role session. So with a user, you might have API keys and they, like when you make those API keys, they could last years if you don't change them. And you can always use those API keys to become a user. With roles, usually you're going to get a set of API keys back that are more temporary and don't last as long. And when you get those API keys back, you aren't technically becoming the role. It's more like you're taking on a temporary role session. And you might already see because you're becoming or because you are leveraging a temporary role session, that's why that third API key is called a session token. Or I don't know if that's exactly why, but that's how I think of it, because with roles you're working more with temporary sessions, and so that's why the third API key in my mind is called session token, because it's more tied to like a session. It's not absolute. It will expire at some point usually. So to actually assume a role and get API creds back, there's a special AWS API called AssumeRole. Pretty self-explanatory per the name again. Again, for simplicity's sake, here on out, you can think about it in the same concept of a user, where you're becoming the user to call an API, like you're becoming the role to call an API. But technically, we'll see you're not necessarily becoming the role. It's more like you are leveraging a role session. The other noticeable difference, and this one's pretty important, is that, again, roles have policies attached to them just like users, but roles have one more extra JSON part attached to them. And this is called a trust relationship. With a role, you essentially add an allow list to the role saying who is allowed to assume the role. If you are not listed in the trust relationship, you cannot assume the role. Again, this just says who is allowed to assume the role. Is it any user in the AWS account? Is it a specific user in the AWS account? Is it like another role temporary session? There's a lot of answers to who could assume the role, and that's what we'll see next. Again, I made hopefully this helpful diagram to help you visualize the kind of the concept we're going to walk, or the workflow we're going to walk through. So for simplicity's sake, we're going to start out with a user still. So on the far left here, this is us. We're like the developer, and we have a set of API keys to become a user. just like we saw in the last couple videos. So you're becoming a user. When you are that user, because remember, every API needs to be explicitly allowed, you actually need a policy attached to user1 that allows user1 to call the AssumeRole API on role 1. So let's assume that's policy A. So user1 has policy A attached to them, and policy A says that user1 can call the AssumeRole API on, let's say, star, right? AssumeRole on any role in the account. Meanwhile, the role, which is a completely separate entity, also has a policy attached to it. Let's say it's called policy B, which gives it access to some resources. In addition, besides the policy that's attached to the role has one more thing attached to it called a trust relationship. And this essentially reads something along the lines of, I trust user1 in this account to assume me. If user1 calls AssumeRole and specifies my role, they will get some temporary credentials to basically become me. Again, it's not necessarily you're becoming the role, it's you're leveraging a temporary role session. But for simplicity's sake, we'll say it's going to vend back some temporary creds to get a role session here. So kind of start from the beginning, you'll use your API keys to become user1. You'll then call the AssumeRole API to assume this role. Once you become this role, you will be allowed to access some AWS resources because the role will have a policy attached to it. Again, maybe snapshotting this might be a good idea, but we will show this in the interactive example, and I'll circle back to this at the end. So to create a role, or to basically set up this diagram I have here, we first need to give this user the AssumeRole privileges, right? If this user does not have is not allowed to call the AssumeRole API, then they can't even call AssumeRole on this role because they can't even call the API. So what we have to do is we're going to add a permission to our user that allows them. Again, it's just another policy. This policy is going to allow the user to call the AssumeRole API on star any resource. So this allows this user to call AssumeRole on any role. So this basically means they can assume any role, assuming that role trusts them. Right? Of course, the role we are going to assume will need to still have a trust relationship trusting the user, but we're going to set that up next. For now, we're going to allow STS AssumeRole, and that will allow our user to at least have the permissions to call AssumeRole when trying to assume a role. So that's what I have set up here. Okay, now, so that was still from the user, right? We're still dealing with the user. This is like maybe the user we created in the last videos. Now we're actually going to create the role. So you're going to go to the Roles tab. You're going to click Create Role. The walkthrough will first ask you about the trust relationship. See, select trusted entity. This kind of wizard through the console is going to say, who do you want to trust? And so you can see there's a lot of things you can choose for who to trust. You can trust an AWS service. You could trust an AWS account. So you could trust a specific user in that AWS account. And then you could, maybe if you know what you're doing, you could do a custom trust policy and set up your own trust policy. And there's web identity and SAML2 and all that stuff. So we will go ahead and choose AWS account in our example. And this will auto-generate some JSON for us at the end. And what we're choosing before or below is we're saying allow this account. So when we bubble this account option for AWS account, this basically means allow any user in this AWS account to assume this role. So we do AWS account, this account, which means any user in this account. We hit next. And remember, a role is just like a user in that a role has a policy attached to it saying what someone can do, or it has a policy attached to it saying whoever assumes this role, what can that person actually do? So we're just going to attach administrator access in this example. I guess that's the one I chose. And again, that's AWS managed, so I just have to search, administrator, and it pops up because it's already pre-populated because it was AWS created. I check that box. Okay, and then I have my summary here. So we give it a role name, a description. This is the policy that's attached to the role. It's saying what the role can do. And then this is our trust relationship. So you can see the trust relationship is also JSON. It has a slightly different notation. So again, it's pretty similar though. Effect is allow, the action is assume role, and the principal is our AWS account. So what this means reading it is allow anyone in this AWS account to call assume role on me. And so this is what the trust relationship looks like. So it's kind of like an allow list, right? You do allow, assume role, and then whatever you want in your allow list. So they could pretty much set this to anything. In this case, we're setting it to any user in our AWS account, which means you need to be a user in our AWS account to assume it. Even if you knew what the role name was and you had control of a user, that user still needs to be trusted through the trust entity. And observe that in the UI, you can actually see trusted entities. So like once I make that role, there's a special column for trusted entities saying who the role trusts to assume it. So in this case, it's just our account number, but you can see like you can also have AWS services. You can trust an AWS service to assume it. And what that means is for some of these workflows, through the console, they'll ask you to make a role as part of creating a resource. And so sometimes you need to trust a service because some services have workflows that require you to set it up that way. Okay, looking at our diagram update here, we basically have our user we created, our API keys for that user. We are here. We're the user at the moment. Our user has a policy that has assume role allowed. And we know that this role exists, let's say, and this role trusts anyone in this account. So, as this user, we're going to call assume role on this role. That is going to be accepted because our user is in this account, and thus we match essentially the allow list in the trust relationship. So we get some credentials back to become this role or to leverage a role session. And then once we're the role, that role has administrator access attached to it, which means we can access everything in the AWS account. So this is what the AssumeRole API looks like. So this line right here, this arrow from going from user to this role, where I say you have to make the AssumeRole API call, this is what that looks like from the CLI perspective. So you can see on the left here, I'm showing you have API creds for the user. So you're making API calls as that user. And then you do AssumeRole, the ARN of the role session name, that can be arbitrary. You can set that to whatever you want. And then the profile again, so you're calling this API as that user. When you make this API call, it's successful because the role trusts your user and your user has permissions to call this API, and you get back a set of temporary credentials. So notice the first two are really familiar, access key ID and secret access key, just like you saw with user. But then you have this third token called session token, which is this massive token. And you can also see there's an expiration tag. So unlike the user API keys that theoretically would never expire, with the role API keys, there might be an expiration date and they might expire within a certain time period. So it's more of like a session, right? Again, that's why I think of this as like session token. And here is the assumed role. So it's saying you are, again, it's like a session, but you can think of it like you are basically that role at this point. So this gave us back our credentials, but we actually aren't the role yet. We're calling this API as this user, and it's giving us back these API creds, but that's all it's doing. We're just getting the API creds back. We have to do one extra step to now take these API creds that were returned and once again load them into our CLI. And once we load them into our CLI, then we will become that role, essentially, or call the APIs as that role. You can do that through two ways. You can go ahead and do environment variables, like I show on the left here. So you can put in the environment variables and then STS get caller identity. It'll read the environment variables and then you're the role. And in this case, you might have to specify a region flag. On the right here, this is if you want to do AWS configure. So you'll notice in AWS configure, they don't give you an option to put in the session token. So you can actually just add it manually to the .aws credentials file as AWS underscore session underscore token, and that will also work. So it's kind of two ways, whichever one you find easier. And once we actually plug in the creds that were returned into our CLI, then we're that role. So again, we're this user, we make the AssumeRole API, we get some creds back, we plug those creds into our CLI. Once we plug in those creds, now we're this role down here, and this role has administrator access, which means we can access everything. So with that, we'll probably jump into the interactive example. So here we are back in the console. Right now we're looking at our user. So again, we're going to create the workflow like we saw in the slides, where you basically we're going to become a user, then we're going to call AssumeRole on a specific role. That is going to return to us some temporary credentials, which we are going to load into our CLI, which then will allow us to make API calls as that role within the role session. So let's kind of break it down. First, we want to make the role that we want to assume. So let's go to roles. Don't worry about these deletion fails. I was trying to delete those earlier, but let's create a role. Now, the first thing it's going to ask us is, what do you want to set as the trust relationship or that allow list? For example, in AWS service, I could check this box, which means only allow EC2 instances or the EC2 service to call or to assume this role. And again, this is going to be much more applicable if you're working within a service. Sometimes they'll have you set up roles, and if you look at the roles that are created in the service and you look at that role's trust relationship, you'll see something like this, where it's trusting a specific AWS service, and that's because it's actually the service itself that's leveraging the role as opposed to you, an end user. So again, not going to dive into that. We're mainly going to focus on AWS account here. So I'm going to choose AWS account, and then I'm going to choose this account. And this is going to allow any, so it says here, allow entities in AWS accounts belonging to you to perform actions. So by checking this button, we're basically adding anyone in this account, like our users, to an allow list to be able to AssumeRole this API. So this is all just the allow list. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this account. Next. And now I'm going to attach a policy, right? So the last screen was about kind of the trust relationship or allow list. And now we need to actually say, hey, what can this role actually do, right? What policies are attached to it? If someone does eventually assume this role, what is that person going to be able to do? So I'm going to go ahead and add administrator. I'm just going to make it really simple. Do administrator access. Again, remember this basically means allow all actions on everything. This is like admin. Again, you shouldn't really ever give this to a role, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to add it and we'll use that. Okay, we're going to call this, let's call this presentation role to assume. This role trusts all users in this AWS account and has a policy attached that allows all actions. Here is our trust relationship. So again, slightly different notation with like principal, but a lot of the other stuff stays the same in terms of JSON. So you have allow anyone in this account to call AssumeRole on this role. And again, you can go even further with these and add like conditions and stuff, but for now we're just going to be looking at principal. And this is a very simple workflow. So then we add, and then this is the policy that's attached to our role. So anyone who actually does end up getting access to a role session is going to be able to make API calls and access whatever is defined by this policy, which in this case is everything because it's administrator access. Not going to worry about tags. Then I'm going to hit create role, and it's as simple as that. So if we look up presentation role to assume, this is what I was talking about. Note how there's a column here that just tells you what the allow list or trusted entities are. So you can tell at a quick glance, okay, this role allows anyone or any users in this account, my AWS account, because you could also specify other AWS accounts here. And in that way, you can get cross-account stuff where maybe I could specify my friend's AWS account, and then a friend can make a user in their AWS account and then assume the role in my AWS account. So this could be any AWS account. And just for the basic use case, I'm going to set it to my own AWS account from up here. But you can also see that some of these have services, right? And they trust services to assume them. And so the trusted entities is a nice column. We're going to click into our role. We have a summary here. Here's the ARN of the role. Remember, this is global, so there is no region, and it gives us this ARN. This is the policy attached to the role. This is what it can do. So again, it can do everything basically. And then notice the role has this new tab called Trust Relationship. And if you click Trust Relationship, this gives you the trusted entities. So you can see it's a bit different than what we saw in the preview, but it's basically, again, it's allow anyone to call the AssumeRole API, or let's see, allow these principals to call the AssumeRole API on me, basically. And remember I said that these roles, when you assume a role, it's usually temporary. So we can see up here, the maximum role session is an hour. So user credentials, remember, are more, will last a lot longer. You know, theoretically, they could last many years and you can just keep using them. Whereas with a role, as soon as you assume a role, that role session, in this case, is only going to be set to an hour. And we can go into edit and we can change this if we want. So right now it's an hour. Maybe we want our role sessions to last a bit longer. You could change it to like 8 hours. But based off this default, once we make the assume role and we'll see the creds, those actually only last for an hour and then they expire. The other thing to note here is when this root keyword might be a bit confusing if you're used to like Linux systems in root. In the context of a trust relationship, this ARN, when you specify root here, root just means any user in that account. So it doesn't actually mean like root like you might think of in a traditional Linux sense. It just means root just means any user in this AWS account. So this basically says allow any user in this AWS account to call assume role on this role. Okay, so we have our role all set up. And now we can try to assume the role as our user. So this is our role. Let's make a note of that. Presentation role to assume. That's the role we're going to try assuming. Let's go to our user. Let's look at the user we've been calling AWS APIs from. So you'll notice that this user at the moment can only read things in Lambda along with some other service calls here, but it's basically part of the read-only access, and they can only call Glacier APIs or some specific Glacier APIs. So note that there is no explicit allow for calling the AssumeRole API. Nowhere in both of these policies does it say this user is allowed to call AssumeRole. Which means, and let's take a look at this, if you try to call AssumeRole on the role we just created, the user is going to get a permission denied because they are not allowed to call AssumeRole. They're like explicitly haven't been given permission to call that API, because remember, everything's pretty granular. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the ARN for the role because we'll need that. Cool. With that, I'm going to switch over to Kali. Okay, this is our Kali instance. I'm going to go ahead and change the name of this user, or this profile, I should say, sorry. I'm going to change the name of this profile that we've been using so it's less confusing, because originally we named this Amazon Glacier user because it really was just tied to Glacier. But since then we've added Lambda and we're going to be adding more permissions. To do that, I'm just going to go ahead and edit that AWS credentials file. And I'm going to change this to, let's just call this, we'll just call it presentation user. Presentation user. I'm going to save those changes. And you can do this in a text editor or whatever. I'm just doing it in Vim. Okay. If we cat that file again, there's presentation user. We can make sure that profile is correct by just doing STS get caller identity profile presentation user. There you go. So this, again, this is like a really nice check of the who am I. Okay, our profile is being read correctly. It's pointing to those, or it's referencing those API keys, and then those API keys work because it can tell what account number. So again, this is from the user's perspective. So we're making these API calls from the user. So now we're going to try calling AssumeRole as the user. So AWS STS. And actually, let me jump to the slides real quick. So looking at this diagram again, we are here, right? This is essentially, the username's different and the role name is different, but we are here, right? We have a set of API keys and we can make API calls as a user. And we've also created a role and we've attached an administrator access policy to that role. So we have the user, we have the API keys, we have the role, and now we're basically going to try making the AssumeRole API call, which is this arrow that goes from user to role. So switching back to Kali, let's go ahead and try making that call. So AWS STS AssumeRole, and then we need the role ARN. I need to grab it again, one sec. And then we need to provide the role session name. Basically, what do we want our role session to be called? Again, this can be arbitrary. It's up to whatever you want to call it. Let's call this presentation session 1. And then we need to specify our profile right, because this is basically saying we're making this API call as this user. Okay, if we make this API call, notice we get an access denied. Right, so we had the correct role ARN, and role session name didn't really matter, it could be arbitrary, and we have correct credentials, so why didn't this work? Well, if you read the error message, you'll see that it's saying when this user was trying to call the AssumeRole API, STS AssumeRole, on this ARN, the user does not have permission to call AssumeRole on this ARN. They literally don't have permission to call that API call. So we need to switch back to the console and give them permissions to call AssumeRole. So let's do that. So going back to our user, presentation user for the CLI, right, they only have like Lambda read access, and they really only have access to some Glacier APIs, but there's no ability for them to call AssumeRole. So let's go ahead and add that. We need to add permissions. Let's attach a policy directly. I wonder if there's just one that's already made. Doesn't look like there's one that's already made that I'm aware of, but there's like some handy shortcuts here, so we can just create the policy in a new tab and we won't lose our progress on this. So I'm just going to click create policy. And at this point, we are creating a policy in the manage policy. Like, this is a separate entity. It's just a nice shortcut here where you can jump right to creating it. So I need to do the STS service. Or I don't know if it's technically called the service, but that's what the name is for the CLI STS. And we want to give them AssumeRole. There we go. Check AssumeRole. Now, when you assume a role, you specify a role ARN, right? So we can make this as restrictive as we want. We could say that the user is only allowed to assume role on a certain role ARN. So let's just do that just for an exercise. So instead of saying all roles they can assume, we're going to say they can only assume a very specific role, namely the presentation Yep, namely the presentation role to assume. And notice we could do we could also do any roles just in this AWS account, or we could do roles in another AWS account. This is where you start getting into cross AWS accounts, because we can assume a role in a different AWS account because we're passing in the role ARN when we're calling this API. So there's nothing stopping you from passing in a role ARN of a role in a different AWS account. But presentation role to assume. Let's add that. Let's do next text. Okay, view. We'll just call this assume role managed policy. This is a managed policy that allows one to assume a specific role created in this AWS account. Create that policy. Okay, again, remember this opened in a new tab, and so we were just creating a modular policy because it was just a little shortcut in the button. So this is the policies tab of IAM. Here's all your managed policies listed again, and there's the one we just created. And we can open it up and we can look at it, and you can see it allows whoever the policy is attached to, it allows them to call AssumeRole on this specific role. So if we wanted to say any role, we could put like a star there in resource. In this case, we have specified a specific role. Remember, it's pretty much how granular you want to make it. So you can specify very specific API actions and very specific resources. And likewise, you can make them very general. So, okay, we've created our policy. Going back to our user, because remember, we're trying to attach a policy to a user here. We can refresh all the policies. Notice how it went from 1079 to 1080 because we just created a new one. And we go ahead and search for the one we just created, and there it is. All right, and so we can check that, and we can say next and add permissions. Now our user has this new policy attached that allows them to call AssumeRole on this specific role. So our user now has the ability to call the AssumeRole API, and the role has a trust relationship that trusts this user. So both of those together mean we should now be able to successfully do the AssumeRole operation. Switching back to Kali, we're going to try making the exact same API call. So notice when we make the exact same API call, now it works because our user that these API creds are tied to now has the ability to call the AssumeRole API on this specific ARN. And so when we make that call, we get the access key ID return, this secret access key, and then we get this big session token. And again, remember our role, the session will only last for an hour, so we have an expiration here. So if I try to use these API creds past or after an hour, they're not going to work anymore. They're just going to be automatically expired. So, if you're working with roles, you might have to periodically go back and get a new set of credentials because the previous ones might be retired, or not retired, expired. So now we have our credentials, but so we got the credentials back, but we're not the role yet, right? It's basically giving us back these credentials and saying they're tied to this role session. Notice this is the name we specified. I said you can specify it as anything. So we have the creds, but now we have to do one more step of actually plugging these creds into our CLI. So let's go ahead and do, let's go ahead and configure these API creds. So AWS configure, let's call this one role presentation role caller. Okay, I'm going to pass in the access key ID. Then I'm going to pass in the secret access key. Then I'm going to pass in the session, or sorry, not going to pass in the session token. Note it doesn't ask me for the session token. So I'm going to put in a default region of US East 1, and then let's do JSON. But these creds are not going to work if we don't have the session token. In fact, if I do AWS STS get caller identity, and I try to pass in the creds we just added, it's going to give me invalid, because we need all three parts with the role, so we don't have the session token. So if you cat.aws credentials, here's the profile we just added, but note there's no session token. So to fix that, you just use a text editor, and we'll see there's an easier way once we get to Pacu, but you'll just get a text editor. You'll go into .aws credentials, you'll do aws underscore session underscore token equals, and actually I think there's an extra quote there. But you can put, let's see here. Let me fix that. So delete that quote. Yeah, it looks like I accidentally copied in a quote. But so remove that quote and also add that third token. Again, just to prove that you need that third part, we'll go ahead and comment out that line. So if I just run AWS STS get caller identity, I remove that quote just to show you that if you just have these two API keys put in correctly, it's still not going to work. You need that session token. So, so if I uncomment that session token, so now we have all three parts in this profile. And I'm using the quotes because there's some special characters in here, so I want to make sure they're interpreted literally here. If I run the exact same command, now it works because we have all three API tokens. So this profile basically is going to work for an hour. And then after an hour, like we saw when the console, when it said this, I think the session time was an hour, and I showed how you could edit that if you want. Because this is an hour, that means after an hour, these creds are no longer going to work. And so we're just going to get like an error if we try to call this. But for now, it's within the hour, so they work fine. So notice it has our account number, and then it's assumed role, and then this is our role name, and then this is the session name that we've given it. So this is essentially the role session. So going back to our diagram, so we started out with the API keys for the user. We then made the AssumeRole API call to this role. That returned a set of credentials for a temporary role session. We loaded those into our CLI, and we went from making calls as this user to making calls as this role. And the AssumeRole operation was successful because the user, A, was allowed to call the AssumeRole API, and B, the role itself trusted that user. So the user was able to call the API, and the role trusted the caller of the API. So there's two things there. I know I'm repeating myself a bit, but those are the two things to remember. There's the trust relationship on the role itself, and then there's the fact that the caller actually needs permissions to call the API to begin with. Now that we have loaded in our credentials and we're calling things as this role session, remember we added the administrator access to that role. So we should be able to call any APIs now as that role session, which basically gives us access to everything. So if we go back to Kali and we do AWS, so for example, our user doesn't have any S3 permissions. So if we try to do AWS S3 LS and we do profile presentation user, which was our original user, right? If we try to make this call, it's going to fail because the user doesn't have permissions to call S3, but the role that we just loaded in has admin access. So that role should be able to call anything. So if we make the exact same call, but instead of supplying the API creds for the user, we supply the API creds for the role session. So just changing that profile flag, you'll see it's successful. So this first one, we're calling the API as the user. The second one, we're calling it as the role session. Remember, this profile is going to expire within an hour, while these user credentials will basically last for however long you keep them valid. So that's another big thing. the time expiration. So role sessions, just got to remember they'll expire. And let's say I try making the same API call in like 2 or 3 hours, I would get a denial or an error message, and then I would just need to call the AssumeRole API again. So if the creds expire, you just make the exact same API call and you'll get a new set of credentials. You can actually just keep doing that and it'll just keep giving you a new set of credentials. But again, the set will only last for whatever the duration is, which in this case is an hour. And so with that, that pretty much covers roles. Kind of going back through the slides again. Remember, a role has a policy attached to it, just like a user saying what it can and can't do. The role has some like differences with the role, or that you have the trust relationship added to the role that says who can, is basically an allow list of who can actually assume the role. And then when you go to assume a role, it's more of a temporary session, and so the set of credentials that are going to be returned are going to expire. Unlike your user API creds, the role ones are going to expire in a given time frame, and the role creds, because, and again, this is how I think of it, because it's a temporary session, you've got this extra token called session token. So session, temporary session, I kind of correlate those in my head, but that's why you have this big extra one. So let's say you get access to an AWS credentials file, and you're going back through your AWS CLI months later, and you're trying to remember what all your credentials and stuff were. Just by looking at this credentials file, you can tell that the presentation role caller profile is a role because it has the session token. Right? The session token is not given out for a user. So you can tell that this is probably for a role, while these two are probably for users. So that's a good way of like being able to glance through credentials and know which ones are for users and which ones are for roles. And notice that when we gave our user the ability to call the AssumeRole API, we specified a specific ARN. And so like you should be able to, or you should be able to know by now that if I change that ARN for the AssumeRole policy attached to the user, what do you think is going to happen if I make the same API call? So let's show that real quick. So here I am back in the user. Here's the policy we made that gives us the ability to essentially assume this very specific role. I'm going to go ahead, because this is a manage policy, I'm going to go to the policies tab and I'm going to edit it here. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to a different role. Let's say a role that does not exist. I'm going to update the manage policy, save the changes. Okay, so in our policies, if we look at AssumeRole manage policy, see how it's changed. So we've edited it. And then if you refresh it over here, so if you click this refresh button and you look at the AssumeRole, you'll see that, again, because it's a managed policy, we just had to change it in one place in the policies tab, and then those changes propagated to all the users or roles it's connected to, so, or attached to. So in this case, it just auto updated for the user that it's attached to. So what do you think is going to happen if the user calls AssumeRole again? What we would expect is you would try to call AssumeRole on the role, but because you're trying to call AssumeRole on a different ARN, this is not going to match, right? There is going to be no rule that allows you to call AssumeRole on the role we want. So we would get a failure. So jumping back to Kali, so notice if we run the AssumeRole API again, then we're going to get a message that says access denied because the user is not authorized to call the AssumeRole API on this resource. We are trying to call AssumeRole on this role, which doesn't match the ARN here. And so because AWS is implicit deny, if we don't explicitly say someone can do something, then they can't do it. So we don't explicitly say that the user can assume the ARN for a presentation role to assume role. We've just specified a role that doesn't exist, so unless the user calls assume role on this specific resource, it's going to get implicitly denied because both the action and the resource need to be allowed. So this ends our first and second section. The first section was just talking about what is a cloud provider, what is AWS, what are services, all that kind of stuff. We looked at S3, EC2, Lambda. I talked about how you can interact with resources either through the UI console or through the CLI. Then we did kind of a deep dive and showed that the CLI just sends HTTP traffic, which you can see in Burp, and the way it authorizes requests is through something called SigV4, and you can use a plugin in Burp to auto-calculate that signature for you so you don't have to worry about it. And then we did a deep dive into IAM. We talked about policies, which are dictate what you can and can't do. We talked about how you can attach them to a user or role. We talked about how users you can access directly with credentials for programmatic access, whereas roles have an extra thing called a trust policy that's basically an allow list that says who's allowed to assume the role. And when you assume a role, you also get an additional token and all the stuff we just covered. So now that we've covered all of that, the next few videos, I don't know if they'll be posted right after these, but I'm going to walk through some common misconfigurations where cloud and web intersect. And so that'll probably be beneficial to both pen testers and developers to show kind of best practices. And then once we get through all of those, we will be looking at the intro to Pacu section, which is like the intro to red teaming. One thing is that the web application vulnerabilities I'm gonna cover are pretty modular. And at this point, with all the information you have, if you're not interested in the web vulnerabilities, you can go ahead and skip or jump to the intro to Pacu section because you already have all the info you need to know about Pacu. The misconfiguration section is going to be very modular and kind of do like smaller chunks of misconfigurations. But again, if you don't want to look through all those, you can always just jump to the Pacu section at this point and kind of get an idea of how you work with the tool.